Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of the Comrade Cast. And today we are going to be focusing on a very important task. As you can see, I have my Red Star lapel pin on. Ditch the Freemasons, but don't worry, they'll be back. As they say, you can't keep a good Freemason down. And today we're going to be focusing on a very important task, which is...
You must construct additional pylons.
And who are we doing it for? Anyway, so I'm expanding my soundboard, as you can see. And by the way, for the Emperor, that's from Dawn of War. So that is from a strategy game. Remember, the rule is that all our soundboard clips have to come from a strategy game. So come on with me here to the Zen Garden. And today I want to talk about something that has been floating around. It's been a discussion around the internet for a little while. And originally I wasn't sure if I was going to do an episode about this because there's been a lot of talk about it, but I think a lot of people really miss the point when they're talking about it, so I wanted to add my voice and maybe add my 2 cents here. I know that there is a lot going on in the world, and I do want to do a very brief update in terms of what's happening vis-a-vis my country and the election that we're having, but it's going to be very short because it's not the topic of today's episode. We'll save that for the end, but today I want to talk about empathy. And I know this has been a talking point, especially on the left, about how conservatives just seem to revel in the fact that they lack empathy and or actively try and discourage it. And this has been bothering me, I guess you could say. This has been on my mind for a little while, and it's been very frustrating. Because at the end of the day, there's something about abandoning empathy or attempting to abandon empathy, which is in of itself a futile task unless you are mentally disturbed. And we'll talk about that in a bit here. But not only that, empathy or having empathy is one of the fundamental aspects that make us human. I don't know if animals really feel empathy or if it's a human aspect. That's actually big. I'm sure there are studies on it. I would be interested to look them up. But that's beyond the pale, right? What we're talking about today is what I believe is a very strictly human emotion, and it's integral to our humanity. And not only that, it's integral to our survival, because without this empathetic strain that exists in almost all humans, we would have wiped out each other a very long time ago. But when it comes to the conversation around empathy, I think one of the things that I've seen lacking in a lot of discourse about this is the fact that empathy is something that's intrinsically human. It's something that human beings have programmed into them from birth. I want to do a little experiment for you guys to show off why empathy is intrinsic to us. So as you can see right here, I have a knife. This is a fine knife. It is one of my kitchen knives, a global Japanese steel knife. Excellent, excellent tool. Get a lot of utility out of this thing. But let's just say I were to take my arm here and outstretch it, and then I was to take this knife and start jamming it into my arm over and over again. What would be your immediate reaction? You would go, "Ugh. Oh, man." In fact, I bet some of you had that reaction just imagining me doing that. And it happens on a subconscious, involuntary level. The fact is, even if you hated my guts, even if you despised me and were cheering on me stabbing myself to death, that initial response would be, oh, you would feel the pain intrinsically that I was feeling. And that's what I mean here. Empathy is something that we all have on a very basic level, and it takes either some sort of like literal mental illness like psychopathy or sociopathy in order to jettison empathy, or it takes some sort of active suppressant of that part of you. So before we begin to talk, I want to take a second here, and we're going to come up with a dictionary definition here that we can all sit around and say, yes, this is what empathy is. We can agree on it. So effectively, let me move this over a little bit. Okay, so we're just going to go with the first one because the second one, it's about like experiencing empathy through art and other media, which is fine. That's good. But we're going to stick with this first definition here. The psychological identification with or vicarious experiencing of the emotions, thoughts, and attitudes of another. So this is a fine definition of empathy. I think it misses out on one critical component of empathy. I actually plugged this into Claude and asked it to define empathy for me as well. And it says empathy is the ability to understand and share feelings of another person. It involves recognizing emotions in others, taking their perspective. And this is the key part here. Responding with appropriate care or concern. And this, I think, is actually a very key part of empathy that gets completely missed in the overall discussion. I remember watching this clip. It was some church leaders who were obviously conservative, and they were discussing the evils of empathy, right? You've probably heard the sin of empathy, which is ridiculous. I just want to highlight what I mean here. I've got a couple of Bible verses which very explicitly say that to be empathetic is one of the core Christian values. We have Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. We have Peter 3:8. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Galatians 6:2, carry each other's burdens. This is the way to fulfill the law of Christ. Luke 6:31, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule, the literal backbone of the religion, is now a sin. It's bizarre. I never thought that I would be more Christly than the majority of Christians, but that's the way I feel. Like, I feel that I follow the teachings of Jesus Christ as a communist better than virtually every Christian that I've ever met. And then we have the last one here, Colossians 3:12. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And these are all fantastic values. Let's be real. That is the one thing when it comes to Christianity that I can never take away from it. If they actually followed Christ's teachings, the world would be an exponentially better place. But I look around and I don't see any Christians doing that. In fact, I see them abandoning these fundamental principles of the religion, basically to make themselves feel better, to put themselves as a pipe-hitting member of the tribe, to basically try and fit into a larger group, and in some cases, use these kind of group dynamics to harm and belittle others. Anyway, back to this point here. I was watching this Christian talk about empathy, right? The sin of empathy. And he was obviously a conservative, and he's basically saying that this is what empathy is, that if you see a guy in quicksand, empathy is you get into the quicksand with him. And I don't know if this guy is like deliberately misinterpreting what empathy is or purposely trying to obfuscate what the meaning of empathy truly is. At the end of the day, though, I don't think it really matters, because that is not what empathy is. Because again, empathy is the ability for you to put yourself in their shoes mentally, not physically. You're not physically putting yourself in the position of the person you're empathetic with. I'll go back to me stabbing myself with the knife. The empathetic response isn't to grab a knife and to start stabbing yourself as well. The empathetic response is to say, holy shit, I better get that away from him, call an ambulance, and get him some medical attention, because if that's what's happening to me, if I were in that position, that is what I would want. Going back to the quicksand, again, the empathetic position is, oh man, if I were in that position that guy in quicksand is, I would be freaking the fuck out. You know what I'd really want to have happen is somebody to come and throw a rope in so they could get me the fuck out of here. And then, of course, they'll try and argue that sympathy is the superior response to empathy, that we need to jettison empathy and just focus on sympathetic responses. I think that's really silly. There really isn't any reason that you have to go with one or the other. In fact, they oftentimes go together, and trying to force these two things apart is silly. But to me, the sympathetic response is usually, well, always look on the bright side kind of thing, right? So the sympathetic response to the guy stuck in quicksand could be, well, at least you're not stuck in a bear trap and bleeding to death. At least you didn't fall into a pit of spikes, right? All things considered, being stuck in quicksand isn't that bad. And you can have that conversation after you've gotten them out of the quicksand. That's where we actually have that discussion. So my point here, to try and actively abandon empathy, is to try and actively abandon a critical aspect of your humanity. And personally, I think that regardless of your political perspective, we are all intrinsically built to have empathetic responses. And in order to suppress that, eliminate it, whatever you want to say, you have to basically build in structures which shield someone from the pain or mask the pain that another person might be feeling. So I don't know if you've ever read this book. This is On Killing by Lieutenant Grossman. And this is one of the most fascinating books I've ever read in my entire life. I've read it about a decade ago, and it continually sticks with me up to this day. And his whole point about warfare in the past, about humans killing other humans in the past, is that killing each other is something we actually don't want to do. Intrinsically, we don't want to inflict pain on other people, but nation states, armies, try and find ways to work around this human guardrail and kind of eke out empathy in the soldier so that they can kill easier. And in the book, Grossman mentions that there's probably about, I believe the number that he throws at is 10%, that there's 10% of the people out there that do actually revel in the idea of killing, the psychopaths who revel in the concept of causing pain and suffering in others. And unfortunately, those were the best soldiers back in the day. But today, we have found ways to override that empathy. And that is basically what his entire book is about. And the ways that we do this are twofold. First off, one of the ways that we do this is that we increase the distance of the kill and add in sort of intermediaries between you doing the action and the other person dying. It doesn't matter if you want to go full.
What are they, protesters?
You're still going to have trouble getting people killing one another. So one of the things that they were finding is effectively that only 30% of soldiers in warfare were actually firing their weapons. Even then, in the cases of the people who were firing their weapons, they were often just doing it for show. They'd shoot above the enemy's head. They would miss their shots intentionally so they could still look like they're participating in the battle, not actually have the blood on their hands. One thing that was very common to find in the Civil War were muskets which had multiple rounds jammed down them. Effectively, you would just have soldiers on both sides refusing to fight, but not wanting to look like a coward. They would just effectively be continually reloading their rifle, or their musket more rather, so it looked like they were doing something. But they were finding that certain classifications of soldiers were not abiding by this 30% rule. In certain circumstances, there were soldiers that were reaching the 100% threshold of pulling the trigger and pulling it to kill. And those soldiers were in positions like snipers. For whatever reason, snipers were almost always willing to pull the trigger and take the kill shot. And then another one was cannon crews and artillery crews. And also when you look into more modern warfare, you'll notice the similar aspects in mechanized brigades, people who are commanding tanks, APCs, and also naval warfare. All of these categories are not following the 30% rule. And the reason is, in some cases, it's the distance, right? When you're attacking somebody with a sniper rifle, they're so far away that it feels a lot less visceral for you, unless you're playing a Sniper Elite and you see the bullet zoom in and go through somebody's brain. But in real life, you don't get that. And then, of course, when it comes to being in an artillery crew or on a tank or what have you, you have a lot of intermediaries that your brain can rationalize away when you pull the trigger, right? When you fire that artillery shell, you don't see the impact that it has. You don't see the people that it kills. It's a set it and forget it. And it's the same with tankers and mechanized crews and people operating naval guns, that there's a lot of intermediaries between you and the killing, that you can rationalize that, hey, right? I didn't kill those people. I just blew up the tank, and it was my tank that blew up the tank. It wasn't necessarily me. You don't actually see the people dying that you killed. But the absolute hardest thing for people to do, that only the absolute sociopaths can do, is kill somebody face to face with a knife. Even in Napoleonic warfare, where bayonet charges were very common, you'd see somewhere in the range of 5% of wounds were actually inflicted via close quarters weapons. And it's interesting that almost exactly follows the percentage of psychopaths that exist in the army that Grossman postulates. But you can get people with enough repetition to become desensitized to killing. And that is the other way that you get around this. For example, in Roman times, they would find that a lot of other civilizations and armies that the Romans were fighting, their opponents would use slashing tactics and slashing attacks on their soldiers. And these are significantly less damaging than stabbing attacks. To stab somebody is a much more likely kill than to slash them, because the wound is much deeper and it's much more likely to hit vital organs. So the Romans were the first to really desensitize their soldiers, and it was one of the things that made their army so effective. They would even deride civilizations and armies that would use slashing attacks. They derided it as unmasculine and unmanly. But it wasn't really until the modern world and the modern era that we saw another army attempt to do this to its soldiers. And this happened in Vietnam, effectively, where psychologists had come up with a method of training soldiers which would desensitize them to the act of killing. For example, they would use, rather than a target board or some sort of piece of wood or something like that, they would create targets which looked like human beings. And they would also attach things like bags of red paint or whatever, so when you shot the target, you would see a simulated blood spatter, effectively. Anyway, long story short, it turned out that this method of training was extremely effective. That after Vietnam, they were finding that the proportion of soldiers that were firing their weapons was upwards to 70 or 80%, a vast improvement over the 30% ratio. And this is also one of the reasons why there are so many bullets expended in Vietnam, because they got the soldiers, the American training got their soldiers to be much more willing to pull the trigger and much more able to pull the trigger. But as a result of this erosion of human empathy and building in them this ability to kill easier, fucked them up. There's a reason why, well, there's a couple reasons why, but one of the main reasons why Vietnam vets had such high levels of PTSD, and we still see these high levels of PTSD among soldiers today that didn't exist back in the past, is because they had this empathy drained out of them, that they were trained to be killers. They were trained to murder people, and they were trained to murder people in a way that human beings hadn't really experienced before, effectively since the Roman times. And it fucked them up. And there's no question that it's still fucking people up today. So my point here being is that at the end of the day, there are ways, and we have done it before, to drain the empathy out of people. But at the end of the day, that effectively destroys who they are. And unless you're in that 10% of psychopaths, this act of trying to drain the empathy away from yourself, it's going to fuck you up. It's going to hurt you in the long term, because you are fundamentally peeling away an aspect of yourself which has been built into your DNA throughout our species history. And do you really think that if we didn't evolutionarily develop this empathetic strain in us, do you really think that we would be alive today? Or do you think that we would have wiped each other out long before the nuclear age, long before the Industrial Revolution, heck, probably even long before the age of antiquity? But ultimately, it is pretty clear that one of the things that is different between what drives people on the left and what drives people on the right is a sense of empathy. And while I would certainly say that conservatives do have empathy, their empathy only extends to the people that are closest to them. Whereas for people on the left, empathy is a universal response, that we can feel empathy for the suffering of the exploited migrant worker. We can feel empathy for the suffering of people who are fighting and dying for causes they don't believe in. We can feel empathy for the people who are crushed under relentless working conditions, even if those people don't have to be close to us in our personal life, and even if we don't actually know these people. We can still feel and understand their pain and try and do what we can to alleviate it. And that is something that I do struggle to understand a lot of times. Why does the empathy dry out when it's not people directly related to them in their real lives? Why, for them, isn't empathy a universal experience that they have for all of mankind, for all, as a Christian would say, all of God's creatures? That's the teaching of the Bible. That's the teaching of the gospel. But once again, it's completely disregarded. Thrust into the dustbin of history, and they will chastise each other for empathetic responses. And that, to me, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you get upset at somebody for feeling empathy? And at the end of the day, if you're going to get mad at people for feeling empathy, if you're going to discourage people from feeling empathy, then that's going to discourage people from feeling empathy from you. And when you're suffering, when you need help, when you want somebody to reach out and to uplift you from the depths of despair, there's going to be a lot less people willing to do that because they have seen how you disregard the feelings of others, and they have seen your lack of empathy. So they might not be so willing to come to your defense. They might not be so willing to help you out in hard times. And especially now that we are headed towards hard times, we need empathy more now than ever. It is never something that we should abandon, because we will be abandoning the survival of the human race if we do. Okay, before we head out today, I am going to take a look at, again, our election happening in our home and native land of Canada. And now that we're about 2 weeks into the election campaign, and only 4-ish, even less than that, weeks left before the end and everything's all said and done, things are really not looking good for the Conservatives. We were talking about there is a potential for a turnaround, for a reversal in the Conservative fortunes, but it really seems that the Liberals have not even hit their ceiling yet. They're not plateauing. As we can see in our election polling, the Liberals, in terms of their raw popular vote share, has continued to go up. And Pierre Poilievre has been really struggling to find his footing in this election. So here's an article. This is from the Economic Times. And this is one of the things that is not a very good indication for the Conservative campaign, because these are usually the kind of headlines that people wait till after the campaign is lost to produce. Right now we have Pierre Poilievre-led Conservative Party in chaos. Insiders call it dysfunctional as infighting over Donald Trump tariffs erupts. And that is definitely one of the ways that I feel about the Conservative campaign right now, is it feels very disoriented. It doesn't feel very focused. And it seems like they're struggling to hammer on a message that their political campaign can gather around. They're still using a lot of the same old tired stuff about wokeness and all that garbage that nobody really cares about. And it's just not landing. It's just not hitting home. People have a lot more pressing concerns right now. Of course, we see the instability happening down south today, right? We had Extermination Day, as I call it, because this is the worst day of the stock market since COVID. So yeah, we're just checking the markets here after Extermination Day hit the world, and we're down almost 1,700 points. This is the largest drop-off in the Dow Jones since COVID, since the lockdowns, which was 5 years ago. Can you believe that it's been 5 years since the pandemic? God damn it, does time fly. In any case, so we can also see, if we go, let's go to the 6 month here, so we can get a picture of what the stock market looked like when Joe Biden was in office. And we can see that we're down almost 3.5% since Sleepy Joe was at the wheel. And this is incredible, right? And the funny thing is, like, I don't really care about the stock market. As a communist, I think it's all a bunch of nonsense anyway. But there are a lot of people who care, and there are a lot of people who take this as economic indicators, and there are a lot of people who have literally trillions of dollars invested in the stock market that is being completely wiped out right now by Donald Trump's tariff policy. And of course, here in Canada, we are very concerned about what Donald Trump is going to do, what his plans are, what he is going to attempt in the future. And the fact of the matter is that Pierre Poilievre has not been able to capitalize on the feeling of Canadians in that regard. He has not been able to assuage a lot of their fears that he will, in many ways, mirror a lot of Trump's policies. So yeah, Extermination Day, biggest meltdown since COVID. And I'm not going to lie, this is the best thing that Donald Trump has done in his presidency, which has wiped out trillions of dollars from billionaires. All these billionaires came together to get him elected, to get him in the office and pour a bunch of money into his campaign, and he rewards them by annihilating their wealth. So yeah, back to Pierre Poilievre's campaign. There seems to be a lot of insiders that are frustrated with the direction that it's going. And I think the thing is really the Conservatives got too comfortable. They got too complacent that they were going to win, and they didn't foresee a scenario where they would have to so rapidly adjust their stance, so rapidly adjust their messaging to combat a new political reality. And it's showing. And it already seems like Conservatives are writing Pierre Poilievre's obituary before it happens. And this is, to me, the biggest thing that is a weakness for the Liberals right now. They are getting complacent now. Just like the Conservatives were getting complacent, now I can see a lot of Liberals getting very complacent, and they think that this election is already a done deal. It's not a done deal. And people here, they think that I'm a Mark Carney supporter, as vis-a-vis the last episode. I am not a Mark Carney supporter. I will not be voting for him. I will be going down with the orange ship. That is where my vote is going to lie. And I would, like I said, never ever vote for a banker. I have a strict principle to never ever vote for financial people, and I'm certainly not going to be breaking that now. But one politician, give a shit what this guy's yapping about. But anyway, one politician who seems to be writing Pierre Poilievre's obituary is our premier, or my premier here in Alberta, Danielle Smith, who every time she opens her mouth, you can see like the Conservatives go down in the polls, because she is seen as a very close ally to Donald Trump, seen as very closely tied to the United States. And it's not hard to see why. She just went down to Florida on Albertan taxpayer money to go speak at an event hosted by PragerU and hosted by Ben Shapiro. And here's the thing, like, if fucking the leader of the NDP here, former mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, if Nenshi had gone on a trip on Alberta taxpayer dime to go sit with Hassan Piker and appear on a Hassan Piker stream, Conservatives would be losing their goddamn minds. It would be the thing you hear about constantly, every day, all of the time. And they would be right. It would be a huge waste of taxpayer dollars. I don't give a shit if Danielle wants to go visit Ben Shapiro on her own dime. She can do whatever else she wants. But don't spend my goddamn taxpayer money to do it. Anyway, so we have this story coming out where it seems like she's already writing Pierre Poilievre's obituary. And she is basically saying that she's going to go around and she's going to have this like referendum campaign, this post-mortem referendum campaign to see what Albertans want to do after the election. And it seems like she's very heavily inferring that the Liberals will be the ones who are going to win that election. And she's asking what Albertans are going to do if another Liberal term is on the horizon. And I think that there's a real possibility that she might try and pull Alberta out of Canada and potentially join the United States. I don't know if, that's in the cards, but at least separate from Canada if the Liberals win. I think this is a pretty clear indication that she's laying the groundwork, she's laying the pipe work, and that is fucking terrifying. And because for someone like me who lives in Alberta, suppose we can't join or leave Canada or join the United States without a referendum, and that's why she's talking about the appetite for a referendum. And our polling shows that even though Alberta is the most right-wing province in Canada, we still wouldn't have voted for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is still very unpopular here. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think the appetite for Alberta to join the United States is there. Even if we do have another Liberal majority, I don't think that's going to force a lot of Albertans to say, you know what, I want to leave and join the United States. I actually think that if Donald Trump wasn't the president, the proportion of Albertans who would want to join the United States would actually be much higher. The fact that Donald Trump is the president makes most Albertans a lot more hesitant to actually join the United States. And it does scare me because if that happens, right, obviously I'm going to vote to stay in Canada if a referendum happens here in Alberta. But if that does happen, like, I don't know what I would do, because it's not like I can just uproot my entire life here, wife, family, kids, house, everything. I can't just pull up my roots and leave on a whim. That's just not realistic for me at this point in my life. And I'm worried that I'm stuck on this goddamn roller coaster no matter what happens. So I'm pretty concerned about the direction Danielle is taking this province. And there are some pretty eerie indications about what she's planning for the future. So anyway, that's going to bring to the end of my ramblings. And until next time, don't forget,
You must construct additional pylons.